Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters, Nick Napolitano and Greg Hess. Greg Hess is Vice President and Regional Captive Practice Leader with AssuredPartners. Greg has over 25 years of insurance brokerage experience. He enjoys working with companies to develop and evaluate alternative risk solutions. AssuredPartners is the 10th largest insurance broker and consultant in the country, providing commercial insurance, risk management, and employee benefits through consulting and services. Nick Napolitano has over 10 years of experience in the insurance and sales management industry. Nick has joined AssuredPartners to focus on the development of the captive vertical to develop national, regional, local resources within his specialty. In his most recent role, he was a successful national sales leader at M&T Bank, while also running 2 offices and retaining a $2.5 million book of business. Nick has spent his career focused on creating complex insurance solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nick Napolitano and Greg Hess.
Great, thank you, Jessica. My name is Greg Hess. I'm with AssuredPartners, as Jessica just said, and I'm part of the construction vertical here at AP. AssuredPartners has a national partnership, as many of you know, with the ASA. And part of what we want to help bring to members is opportunities, educational wise, and also for some alternative solutions when it comes to insurance products and protecting your businesses. Today, we are going to talk about captives, but primarily we want to have a discussion and teach you a little bit about what captives are, but we also primarily want to find out, engage interest in developing possibly a specific captive just for ASA members. So at the end of this presentation, we're going to send out a quick questionnaire and a couple questions to see if you guys, anyone here, the members are interested. And we're going to try to build some momentum to gather a number of members that we can join in and create a captive from the ground up, which would offer a lot of great benefits to the ASA members. But first, we need to learn a little bit about what captives are, how they work. And that brings me to Nick, who has a lot of experience in developing captives from the beginning, as well as helping assist clients and members get placed into construction-specific captives. So we'll go through a little bit on what captives are. Please feel free to type in a question at any time, and we'll go through it. We get into some specifics regarding how claims are handled in captives, and you may have some questions there. So go ahead and just raise your hand. We're happy to stop and answer your questions. So with that, Nick, go right ahead.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate the introduction, you framing the meeting. So as Greg had alluded, really the primary purpose of today's meeting is going to be to go through what we call Captive 101. So this is a concept that can certainly drive tremendous value, particularly in the construction industry. We have several hundred construction clients that we currently have in group and single parent captives. But really the genesis of the success, particularly at the beginning, is to really understand, how this mechanism functions. So that's going to be the primary focus today. From there, if this is something that you think could make sense for you, we'll help quantify the benefits for not only just ASA, but also as individual companies as well. So please feel free, any questions that you have, to put them forth. So with that said, we're going to spend about 20 to 30 minutes going through a PowerPoint. Frankly, we haven't, there's no better way to go through and explain, because again, this is a different model from an insurance standpoint, than what you're likely accustomed to. Some of you may have some varying degrees of experience with captives and exposure, but this is really going to be Captive 101. So with that in mind, what is a group captive? It's really an insurance company operated for the benefit of its members. It's a licensed insurance company that's recognized as an admitted carrier. So from a certificate standpoint, it looks and acts just as a traditional insurance company would, what you're accustomed to with your standard market insurance programs. And it insures and reinsures the risk of its owner or unrelated parties, in this case, the owners of the group captive itself. There are, Zach, if you want to go to the next slide. Yeah, there are different types of captives. So, if you're a much larger organization, if you have large property holdings, there are different types of captives. But really for this audience and the members of ASA, a group captive is, going to be most relevant and provide the most benefits. So that's why we're really going to hone in on group captives. So really the biggest benefits, or the reason that individual companies join a captive or organizations form a captive is to get outside of the standard market and get in a more performance-based program. So in a captive, not only is your pricing from like an upfront, what you pay on a quarterly basis is very largely performance-based and very largely individually performance-based, but also your net cost is also going to be based on your own individual performance, in large part based on how you can control claims between $0 and $100,000. So there's the opportunity to return underwriting profit. We're going to quantify and show some examples of exactly how that would work. Within the captive program, particularly in the last couple of years, we've seen a very large difference between the performance of captives compared to standard market programs. And when I say standard market programs, that's just, if you're with Travelers, Hartford, Liberty, just a traditional work comp, general liability, auto liability insurance program. So when I'm saying standard market, that's what I'm referring to. So over the last 3 years, and in some cases geographically 5 to 7 years, we've seen the insurance market harden, right? That's going to happen from time to time. It's cyclical in nature. But as the insurance market hardens, the standard market, you see it becoming more challenging to find coverage. You're seeing more challenge to attain the limits that you need. But probably what's been most painful is you've seen a tremendous increase in the cost of insurance across the board. And oftentimes that's not based on your individual performance. That's just because the portfolio across the board is taking very large increases. The construction and transportation industries have been hit particularly hard in this regard. We've seen, it's not uncommon for, construction companies' insurance to go up 30, 50% in a given year. And they will look back and say, well, we haven't had any claims or nothing of substance. Why is this happening? It's just a function of the actual market. And the insurance companies essentially are spreading out their need for increases in premium. And oftentimes it's the better performing companies that really feel that pain because they're not contributing to the losses, but they are contributing to additional premium. Whereas in a captive, you're probably going to hear me say this 4 or 5 times, there's a lot more stabilization built into the model. When you quantify how the program is built and you understand that, it's only the program itself the performance of the program itself accounts for 96% of the premium, you see a much higher level of stabilization. So to me, that's sort of emerged as the biggest benefit and the long-term benefit, especially now with the market being very hard. You also have quite a bit more control in a captive from a claims handling perspective, depending on whether or not ASA endeavors to build their own captive, the members could have control in how the captive functions, what deductibles, or I should say retentions there are. We'll talk a bit more about that. Within a captive, you have group purchasing power that applies to several of the levers or functions of the captive. We'll also talk more about that. And then ultimately, what we're here for, why I got into this business, is because it drives reduced insurance costs for the right candidates. Okay, so who fits a captive? So you need to be a financially stable company. As part of the vetting process to join a captive, you submit your financials. It's reviewed by a third party CPA. There's no, cutoff or anything, so to speak. It's just, a healthy balance sheet, able to pay your premium, consistently making money. Commitment to loss control and risk management. This is probably the biggest determining factor when we're looking at who fits a captive. So this is going to really be determined in two ways. Number one, it's going to be determined by your historical losses compared to the premium which you've paid. In other words, your loss ratio. That's going to be a determining factor. And then there's also going to be a risk control assessment, or a questionnaire, if you will, which is going to help the group identify your practices and procedures, relative to the benchmarks in which they put in place that you need to achieve in order to join the group. So the reason that the captive market has been extraordinarily successful is because they have outperformed the standard market. So in order for this whole model to work, it really comes down to better performance from a loss control standpoint. So commitment to loss control and risk management is really the cornerstone of which this successful model has been built, duplicated, and organically grown throughout this country. From a premium perspective, I think it's fair to say $200,000 between your auto liability, workers' compensation, and general liability collectively. Now, there are some construction captives where you can actually join with less than $200,000. But I think $200,000 as a combined premium for those three lines of coverage is a pretty good rule of thumb. Loss ratio, when you think, well, shoot, what's my loss ratio and how does that compare to the folks that are getting into captives? Again, rule of thumb, if your loss ratio, which is just the percentage of claims paid out compared to premium paid in over a 5-year period, is 40% or better, then you're likely going to be a candidate at that point. Sometimes, in my experience, I've seen organizations with a 50% loss ratio, maybe they just have one large claim, still end up being a great fit. And sometimes we look at organizations that have a 3% loss ratio and they're just absolutely amazed with the amount of money that's been left on the table in the standard insurance market. You need to have a risk for, or an appetite for risk, high tolerance. I would just say an appetite for risk, and certainly a long-term approach to your insurance program. So it's more of an investment. We'll get into some of the financial mechanics from a collateral perspective, but just from a philosophy standpoint, you're looking at this as a multi-year purchasing strategy, which will ultimately save tons of time for any of those of you who have gone through the marketing or bidding your insurance out. It's not fun, and sometimes in a harder market where cost continues to increase, it's something that construction companies are sort of feeling obligated to do annually. The reality is, once you join a captive, you certainly are free to go and look at other options, but the retention rate for companies in a captive is 99% and change. So I think that really speaks for itself. It really is a multi-year approach. Okay, so premium development. This is really where this gets a little bit more technical, and this is where we begin to really diverge from the standard insurance market. So when you look at a captive, you really have two buckets. Okay, you have your loss funds, and you have your fixed expenses. Okay, so just for conversation's sake, and since we're addressing the construction industry here, you can think about a loss funds is going to ultimately be about 60% of your premium that you pay. Your fixed costs, which are your sunk costs, are going to be about 40%. All right, maybe slightly more favorable than that, but that's, again, rule of thumb. So your loss funds plus your fixed costs, that's what equals your premium, right? That you pay, in 4 quarterly installments in a captive. Okay, so let's talk first about how your loss funds are developed. They're developed essentially based on your performance by a third-party actuary, and they're going to look at your premium, your historical premium, historical exposures, and then your incurred losses over the past 5 years. So when you look at, we're going to get into how they bifurcate the loss fund, but we'll show an example here in a minute. But your loss funds drive your fixed costs, and your losses or claims dictate your loss funds. So you can see, kind of going back to that control, the member truly does have control of their insurance destiny here and control of their ultimate cost, particularly when you're looking at an organization's ability to control their frequency. Okay, remember, the frequency is going to really drive costs up or down when you're looking at overall performance. Okay, so the loss funds, again, 60% of your premium, that is being paid to cover future claims for that given year. Your fixed costs are essentially covering the overhead of the captive. Okay, so policy services, reinsurance, we're going to talk about what part of the captive is reinsured. It's going to cover your risk control. The captive manager has somewhere around a 4 or 5% fee. You still have claims to handle and adjudicate. So we have claims administration, and then just the traditional taxes and surcharges, because Uncle Sam still needs to get their mitts on percentage of the premium, just as they do in the standard insurance market. Okay, so we like to just show this visual here so you can we can kind of switch gears for a second and think about how this program comes together, really from a vertical perspective when you look at the actual limit, right? So if you're in a captive, you think about $1 million limit, okay, of insurance, probably similar to what you have now. Frankly, many of the captives are now offering $2 million limits to help offset a very challenging umbrella excess market. But for the first $1 million, we're really going to drill down on this for now, okay? So for the first $100,000 of any claim, okay, is going to be coming out of your A fund. Sometimes that's referred to as your frequency fund, because that's really what it is. But your A fund is going to be pre-funded, or I should say you're paying that throughout the year based on your historical exposure and your historical claims. So it's going to be different for each member, but on a percentage basis, it will be the same for all members, but it will be unique to each member. Your B fund is going to cover claims, I should say your B fund, the group's B fund, will cover claims between 100 and 350,000. Okay, I'm sorry, I should say 101 to 350,000. And then any claim that exceeds 350,000 up to $1 million is going to be reinsured. So when we look back at your fixed expenses, there's reinsurance, or let's just call that regular insurance. That's no longer the captive's obligation once it exceeds 350,000. Is going to then be reinsured by, a Zurich, AIG, Travelers, a large, big box insurance company. Now, in addition, Zach, I'm sorry. So in addition, the captive also purchases aggregate reinsurance. This is particularly important if we ended up moving forward in ASA, it made sense to start their own captive. Let's just say every member in the group exhausted their A fund, their B fund, and they all exhausted a full A fund assessment. We're going to get into what that means later. And the captive was essentially broke for that year. Every single member utilized all of their funds. At that point, the retention essentially drops down to $1, and this becomes a guaranteed cost policy, and the aggregate reinsurance kicks in. Now that's, again, depending on the size of the captive, I mean, it goes from extremely unlikely to pretty much impossible, but I did want to mention that there is that safeguard in place. Return of underwriting profit. How does this really work? So in this example, we're going to use, this is perfect. So they use 60/40. So we're going to use a total premium. And again, this would be like looking at one member. This isn't like looking at the captive on an aggregate. This would be one member, a sizable member that pays $1 million in premium between their workers' comp, general liability, and auto liability. Of that $1 million, remember it's going into essentially two buckets. $600,000 for loss funds, $400,000 for fixed expense. The $600,000 is essentially on the table. That's what's going to be eroded by losses and then ultimately earn investment income and be distributed back to the member. So in this case, simply put, you'd have $600,000 in loss funds. If you had $150,000 in claims, captive net cost $550,000 because you're going to be receiving back a total of $450K in dividends. Now, this is a very elementary example. It doesn't include risk sharing. It doesn't include investment income, which frankly, oftentimes essentially offset each other. But the captive net cost is $550. So you're going from $1 million in paid in premium, which would likely be equivalent with like a standard market program. And this is just showing a bit of the upside. We're going to get into more detailed loss examples here in a minute. So talking about stabilization, which I know I kind of hammered on that earlier, but we'd like to show an example here. And I think this is great because it's going to show how the captive program is in a lot of ways much more insulated from the cycles of the market, right? So if you're in a standard market, guaranteed cost program, you're paying $1 million in premium and, you've been performing well. So it's not like you're looking down the barrel of a 50% increase, but you're still going to see a 10% rate increase, right? So that rate increase, unfortunately, in the standard market is going to be applied to your entire premium, right? So that 10% is going to represent $100,000 of increased premium for your renewal, okay? In the captive program, since the vast majority of your pricing and therefore also net cost is going to be highly dependent on your performance, the only portion of your premium that's going to be impacted by the cycles of the market is the reinsurance portion. Remember that when you have a claim that exceeds $350,000 individual claim, it's going to then be reinsured, right? So that reinsurance still has some exposure to the market. Now, the captive buys that more favorably, going back to group purchasing power. But let's just say we had a 10% rate increase on reinsurance, which, by the way, personally, I've never even seen over a 5% rate increase on reinsurance in a captive program. But let's just apples to apples here. So you have a 10% rate increase. That's only going to impact 20% of your premium because only 20% of your premium is comprised of reinsurance cost. And again, frankly, this is conservative. It's probably more like 15%. So that 10% increase is only going to be applied to $200,000 or 20% of your premium, resulting in additional expense of $20,000, as the market hardens in this example. So you can see from a stability perspective, this is, showing an example of the difference between the standard market and the captive program. Now, anecdotally, where I see, where I think about the staggering difference from a stabilization standpoint between guaranteed cost and the captive program is on a year where, you have that $1 million claim, $2 million claim. And in the standard market, it's typically going to be one of two things that's going to happen. Either you're going to be non-renewed from that carrier at renewal, and you're going to have to go and, find insurance elsewhere in the standard market. And, they're going to essentially know that you don't have a whole heck of a lot of leverage because you're a construction business. So there's not as many carriers. The market's not as robust. So you're going to see a very substantial increase, likely, again, based on my experience. Whereas in the captive program, as we're going to see here, it doesn't, that $1 million program or that $1 million claim doesn't have the same impact. Your premium may go up 5% the following year, but it's very predictable, and we can show you in the formula, because when we actually look at the pricing, the actuaries work, we can kind of follow the bouncing ball and say, look, this is what your premium is. This is exactly how it was developed. And essentially, this is not just what time it is, but this is how the watch works. And I've had many CFO clients that, can go through that on their own after a couple of years and really, truly have a good understanding of how their claims kind of dollar for dollar impacts their overall pricing within the captive program. And in addition to that, I've had clients call me that are in a captive. Maybe they just joined and then they had a large claim and they said, oh my God, this, is this going to be insurance Armageddon? And we're able to, kind of give them peace of mind to say, look, within 2%, we can show you 9 months in advance how that one claim is going to impact your premium for the following couple of years. Where in the standard market, it's really more, there's, so much more subjectivity that you'd never be able to predict how that $1 million claim is going to impact them in the future. It's going to hurt, there's going to be pain, but to what degree? Really, it's very, very difficult to say, even with all the resources that we have. Thanks. Okay, so the captive has an unbundled approach, which we feel, and again, based on experience and results, creates a heck of a lot more accountability because everybody in the captive is working for the members. The members are the owners of the captive. Okay, so when we say insured here, that's each individual construction company. Each company, each member has an equal share in the captive, equal share of stock, equal vote. You have your broker, which plays essentially a similar role to what you're accustomed to. However, when you're in a captive program, there should be more hands-on support from a loss control and claims handling perspective because now you have skin in the game and there's more emphasis and more upside on that. But effectively, the broker has similar function. They help place the insurance. That's our role. They place the lines of coverage that are within the captive. They also place the lines of coverage that fall outside the captive. You have a fronting carrier, which essentially means that they're providing the actual template or insurance policy, because at the end of the day, you receive an insurance policy and it doesn't say captive on it. It says, Liberty or AIG or Zurich, and it's just a standard insurance policy that is going to, hold up when you have a claim, and it's going to be able to provide all the necessary documentation for your prime contractors and your clients that you do work for that you're beholden to contractually. The captive provides the legal, the actuarial, accounting, and banking support. Again, as your broker and as professionals in this arena, and this is where we live in the captive space. We help facilitate and coordinate those four and additional resources, including loss control and claims. And then the reinsurance we talked about is purchased by the captive. So the nice thing is that everyone here works for the captive, works ultimately for the member, and every one of these providers or partners, if you will, is replaceable. So I've worked with captives that felt that their reinsurance cost could be tightened up. The members at the board meetings, which occur twice a year, can vote and say, we would like to conduct an RFP, and we think that we can get a better bang for our buck with our claims, with our third-party administrator who handles claims, with loss control, with reinsurance. I mean, shoot, if your broker in the captive isn't doing the job that you think they should, they're replaceable. We're replaceable. So this really puts the ball in the court of the member, and they have a lot more control, not only in their cost, but in the claims process and in determining who they're working with, or I should say, who's working for them. Okay. Again, I'll go through this briefly because it's a bit redundant, but sample captive pricing. So for an organization, construction business that pays $1 million, again, you have your lost funds, which are actuarially determined. In this case, $600,000. Your fixed costs are going to be a percentage of your lost funds. So ultimately, the better your performance is from a claim standpoint, the lower your premium is, the lower your lost funds are, the lower your fixed costs are, because again, the percentage remains constant for each member. Your lost funds are then bifurcated into two groups: an A fund, which is actuarially determined to cover claims between 0 and 100 or 125 or 150,000, depending on the captive. And then the B fund is to cover your severity fund, or claims between 125 to 350. Again, it can vary captive to captive. In addition, the 400,000 of fixed expense, it's the overhead of the captive, the fronting, the reinsurance expense, claims handling, risk control. Your broker is going to receive a commission, and that's really the sunk cost. When we look at the investment income within the captive, as soon as you're paying in your premium, that $600,000 would be earning investment income throughout the year, or I should say until the day that those dollars are paid out for your claims. So the benefit that the insurance company is typically receiving, which is investment income, which frankly is how they make the majority of their profit, is now being passed on to the individual members. And with the captives that our organization works with, and frankly most group captives out there, the members own all of the investment income. We can talk a little bit more about the different nuances there, but you're seeing roughly 6% returns on an annual basis. But that lost funds are what's on the table from an investment income perspective. Lori is going to help me out here and go through a couple of loss scenarios.
Mm-hmm. I am. Hi, by way of introduction, my name is Lori Harris. I am the captive director within the AssuredPartners Captive Vertical. So happy to be here today. And as Nick mentioned, I'm going to run through some loss scenarios for you. So as Nick just mentioned in the previous slide, we're going to assume the same figures that he discussed. We have the A fund, which is the $450,000 of our loss fund that's allocated to that portion of claims, which you will retain the first $100,000 for. Then the $150,000 of the $600 is housed in your loss fund total, but in the B fund or shared fund. And that's the shared layer where all members participate in claims from that $101,000 limit to the $350,000 limit. So in this example, we're going to look at 3 small claims within your policy year or program year that all total $100,000. Each of those claims are going to be assumed to be under that $100,000 limit. If you look here in yellow, you'll see we have a claim at $25,000, a second claim at $25,000, a third claim at $50,000. That's where we're assuming the total within the red circle of the $100,000 of claims within your A fund. Off to the right, as Nick mentioned before, A fund can also be known as frequency fund. B fund can be also known as severity fund or shared layer. So as we mentioned, $450,000 in initial premium in your A fund plus $150,000 in your B fund is that total $600,000 or 60% of your loss fund premium. All right. We look at the claims totaling, as I mentioned, 25, 25, and 50, 100,000. Because each of them are under that $100,000 limit, you're responsible for that full figure. And we take that from your frequency or A fund. So we start with an initial balance of 450, less the 100,000 in those three small claims, leaving you an A fund balance of $350,000. So after you've experienced those three small claims, if we run across the bottom line, your A fund balance is 350 plus the remaining balance, 150,000 in your B fund. You didn't touch that, didn't have any member sharing in this example. So your fund balance or your loss fund balance is $500,000, which at the end of the program year, should you not experience any other future claims, you will see that in the form of a potential dividend or underwriting profit. Okay. All right, let's build a little bit further. In the previous slide, we assumed three small losses totaling 100,000. In this slide, we're going to build on it, and we're going to add three more claims at $125,000 each. This is going to be a moderate loss year, okay? It's not a catastrophic, and it's just a little heavier than what we just talked about. So down here in this example, you'll see that we have the same three claims we started with, okay? Then we're going to add on to that the three additional claims at $125,000 total. So Zach, do you want to feed on the next? Yep, and even one more. Perfect, thank you. Okay, in this example, as I mentioned, each member is responsible for every claim out of their loss fund dollars up to that $100,000 limit. These three claims equal $100,000. So then we have these next three at 125. We're only going to retain in our A fund level $100,000 of each of those claims. These in the circle equal the $400,000 subtracted from the A fund. Zach, if you'll release the next interactive function, perfect. Okay, same scenario. We remove the $100,000 from the previous slide, leaving us the balance of $350,000. We now experience the next set of three claims. We're going to retain in that frequency level the $300,000. We're going to subtract that from the balance, leaving you $50,000 left in your frequency fund. But as you'll notice in the next circle above, down here in your example, we have $25,000 left over, $25,000 and $25,000 that exceed your A fund responsibility. We're going to take that out of the B fund or the shared fund. Now, it's not fair to ask any of your other members to participate in your claims until you've allocated your own funds towards your own claims. Once we've exhausted your premium dollars, that's when we look to ask your other members to share with you, okay? If we look at the severity fund example over at the top right-hand corner, we started with $150,000. We're going to subtract from that $75,000. That's the $25,000 in yellow in the second circle from the B fund, leaving you a severity fund balance of $25,000. So at the end of this program year, assuming those six claims, we have $50,000 left in your frequency, $75,000 left in your severity, with a total of $175,000 left in your fund balance, which you could recognize in the form of a dividend or your underwriting profit. Okay. Zach, you want to go to the next slide? Okay. In this example, what we're doing is we're going to look at what happens should you experience a catastrophic or $1 million claim after you've already experienced the claims we just talked about in the previous slide. In this example, same situation. We've got the three initial claims at $100,000. Then we have the additional 3 claims at the $125,000 each. Then we experience within the same program year $1 million claim. In this example, you can see where the first $100,000 of the catastrophic claim is going to come from your A fund. The balance, the $250,000 out of your B fund, because we're responsible, as we mentioned before, $101,000 up to the $350,000. That's that $250,000 layer that we're going to take from the B fund. The remaining dollar, or the remaining amount, the $650,000 of that $1 million claim, is then placed on the reinsurer to cover that. Exactly. And then we also have each member carry an umbrella policy to sit on top of all 3 lines of coverage, your auto, work comp, and GL. All right. Thank you, Zach. I was just going to ask you to release those next. Thank you. All right, in this example, you can see here where we've already reduced your frequency fund by the $500,000 of total claims experienced. And we've covered that catastrophic claim up to the balance that you had, which puts us at a $50,000 deficit. All right, we're going to talk about assessment in a moment. We'll need to assess you as a member for underfunding your A fund in the experience of that catastrophic loss. With your severity fund, we have paid your total contribution to that B fund, and then we've asked your members to contribute that $175,000 level, and that's where the risk sharing comes into play, leaving you a balance in your severity fund. As Nick mentioned, you can see at the bottom the balance is 000, but while your funds were sitting in your loss fund account, you were earning interest, and that is still payable to you in the form of a dividend, and you would recognize that as dividends are released. But we still show that there's $50,000 that we've underfunded. So, Zach, I'm going to ask you to pop forward 2 slides. Okay. What happens here, as you can see, this is just a snapshot of the result. We will ask you to make payment back to yourself to cover any claims that you may have if the program year is still ongoing, or to refund the underbalance of your program. And then Zach, if you go down 1 more slide, yep, there we go. So what happens is we don't ask you to fund that immediately. We're going to ask you in the first year, as you're assessed, to pay 50% in 2 equal installments of that of that amount due, $12,500 and $12,500. We then ask you in year 2 to pay 25% of the $50,000 due, broken down into 2 installments. And then the third year, we'll get that final $25,000 due. I'm sorry, 25% due in those 2 installments as well. What we try to do is not ask each member to have such an outlay of cash in 1 year, so that they can realize that over a period of time. Zach, if you go back up 2 slides, I think 1 more. All right. So that's how collateral. Yep, right there. So that's how what some of the different claims or loss examples look like. Beyond that, now I'm going to ask Nick to take over. We're going to talk about collateral and what that means for the program.
Sure. Thanks, Lori. Great job. So from a collateral perspective, let's talk about the purpose of collateral. So when looking at the group captive program, the reason that the collateral exists fundamentally is to eliminate a scenario where there would be a member-to-member financial obligation. So in this case, you have your exposure, as Lori just mentioned, is really your A fund plus your B fund plus your fixed expense. However, if you exceed your A fund, okay, so in other words, you have a poor year, you have high frequency of claims, and you have an assessment, the captive wants to hold on to that collateral in case they were to have a member just say, well, I'm not going to pay this assessment, I'm just going to walk away. Well, they have collateral to draw down on. Now, frankly, this collateral is really not meant to be used. And I mean, I've actually never seen collateral drawn down on, but the program is collateralized for the function of eliminating any potential member-to-member obligation. So the format and the formula for calculating the collateral is really quite simple. It ends up being 2 times your A fund over a 3-year period, okay, and it's not going to exceed 2 A funds, okay. So in this case, you're going to have 2/3 of your A fund in year 1 posted, another 2/3 in year 2, another 2/3. But essentially, the collateral component is ultimately going to be 2 times your A fund posted over a 3-year period. Likely, and I say likely because it depends on where the captive is domiciled. You can either post cash or a letter of credit. Letter of credit, just simply comes from the bank. Costs a 1.5 a year. If you post cash, if you have excess cash in the business, it is invested in the captive investors fund up until the time in which you leave the captive. So with that said, before we jump into next steps, and I hope that everyone was able to join back on, do we have any questions that were logged?
There were not any questions in when we got disconnected.
Okay. Greg, would you like to address next steps, or would you like me to?
Well, yeah, it was just to round out. So what we're looking for a viable captive member from ASA, basically someone that is going to have, mentioned before, solid loss history over a 5-year period. Will be a risk taker to an extent. There is a loss sensitive aspect, obviously, to the captive. Financially viable member, financial strength is important, so you put up collateral, and just typical size of premium. Looking for an ASA member that needs to generate around 200,000 or more in premium in those 3 key lines. So our next steps, we want to gauge the interest of all ASA members. Anyone that is interested at all in learning more about captives, they want to be considered to be one of the initial members of a potential captive that we build for the ASA membership. Please reach out to us, and we will follow up with you with some additional questions and a discussion to see if you'd be a good candidate to initially get into a captive. But ideally, we'd like to generate a dozen or more interested members that would qualify to be a captive, and then we can kind of hit the ground running at that point. So next steps would basically be, I think we're going to send out a very short questionnaire, a few questions to gauge your interest and see if you're going to be the right fit at that point. I know that this webinar is going to be watched down the road by a number of the ASA members, so we'll have to give it a little time for everyone to get a chance to view our program, and at that point we'll reach out again to all membership and let them know where we stand in potentially building a specific ASA captive.
Yep. And Greg, just a couple points to add. We will develop when we gather the both the information on an aggregate and individual basis. We'll formulate the pro forma, which is going to ultimately determine whether or not the ASA captive specifically it will work. We would then essentially be reporting back to the group to say, look, this is how the group would have performed. And that will give us a very, very good indication as to what the financial value is. Is this going to work on an aggregate basis? And then, as this is just kind of pointing out the obvious, but if it didn't work on an aggregate basis, we can still look at, individual ASA members to say, does it make sense to join a different captive if the ASA captive doesn't get off the table. So we're committing some pretty good resources here to bring you folks some value. So those on the call now and those that will listen later, Jessica, I think is going to post the questionnaire alongside the recording for those that listen later on. So that's where you'll find it. And again, that questionnaire is going to ask for, in addition to, probably some pretty generic, pedigree information on your company, and from a nature of operations perspective, what we're really interested in seeing is how you've performed, right? Because that's really, that's frankly really what's most important. Because what we're going to be able to show you is how much money did you leave on the table? I mean, if the insurance company has made a profit that's significant off of your company over the last 5 years, that's where we come in and say, look, there's a better way to do it. The group captive is that vehicle. And, we would love to do that for this group, as we have for others. We've built other construction captives. We've built transportation captives, long-term care captives. So we certainly have the personnel internally here to get that done.
Great. So I think that pretty much concludes our presentation for today. I'd like to thank Jessica for putting it together, and we look forward to hearing from all the interested ASA members and taking it from there to the next step.
Wonderful. Thank you all for the presentation today. I do see one question, and it is, are there any classes of business that would be preferred or ones to avoid?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is it varies, quite frankly. For the purposes of forming a new captive, I'm going to answer with a big sort of it depends, meaning we think about like commercial roofers as being obviously like a heavier class of business, but there is a homogeneous commercial roofing captive that performs extraordinarily well, which is counterintuitive because of the standard insurance market, doesn't have much of an appetite for it. So as a rule of thumb, I'm going to say no. There's not any classes that are like, fundamentally excluded. But from a line of coverage perspective, we're probably not going to get outside of workers' comp, auto liability, general liability for the purposes of a construction business. If you have a significant pollution exposure, again, we would help you place that separately. But I hope that answers your question.
Okay. So I don't see any other questions at this point. So we will go ahead and conclude our webinar. Again, thank you all for your presentation. Thank you for everyone joining us today. And we will get this recording up on the website by the end of the day today. So feel free to access it and pass it along to anyone that you think might be interested. So we will conclude, and we look forward to you all joining us on our next ASA webinar.